Late in 1936, a French chambermaid stood a few feet from Wallis Simpson and watched her feed a single torn page of her own diary into the fire, watched it curl, blacken, and vanish before the morning light came up. If this account has been useful, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are already queued. The bell notification means you will see them. Now, back to the fire. It was the small hours in one of the rented rooms of exile, or the borrowed grandeur of a French chateau. Wallis knelt at the grate. The maid, named in the household record only as a French chambermaid, stood close enough to see the paper move. And it did move. Heat took the edge of the page first, browned it, then the whole thing curled inward like a fist closing, and the ink went with it. Picture the room the way the maid did. No fine speech, no camera, no audience. Just a woman on her knees and a page turning to ash. Whatever was on it mattered enough that it could not be crumpled and thrown away, could not be locked in a drawer, could not survive one more sunrise. It had to be gone, and it had to be gone before dawn. The maid never forgot it. Years later, that quiet minute passed through a household testimony to the biographers who collect such things, and it is almost the only reason we know it happened at all, which leaves two questions hanging in the smoke. What was written on that page? And why did it have to burn before the light came up? Everything that follows is the answer to those two questions. Hold that image of the curling paper, because we come back to it. So who was the woman at the grate? Her name was Bessie Wallace Warfield, born in Baltimore in 1896, not into a palace, into genteel American money that had mostly run out, raised by a widowed mother who counted every dollar. By 1936, she was twice married and twice divorced, an American commoner with no title, no throne in her blood, and no great fortune of her own. On paper, she was the least likely woman in the world to end up kneeling at a fire, burning a secret a king would have paid anything to protect. And yet, on paper, was exactly where the trouble lived, because there were two Wallis Simpsons, and they could not both be true. To America, she was a fairy tale, the Baltimore girl who crossed an ocean and won a king. American front pages ran her face like a movie star's, the commoner who had walked into Buckingham Palace and walked out with the heart of an empire's ruler. Romantic, impossible. Ours. The United States adored her precisely because she was one of them. Proof that a girl with no crown could still take the biggest one on earth. To the British establishment, she was something else entirely. A foreigner. A woman with a past. Twice divorced. And both husbands still living, which was the part that could not be waved away. Because the King of England was not only a man, he was the supreme governor of the Church of England, the defender of the faith, and that church did not remarry divorced people while their former spouses walked around breathing. You could not crown a twice-divorced American beside the defender of the faith. The math simply did not work, and everyone in Whitehall knew it. So here is the gap, and this whole story lives inside it. On one side, the sweetheart of American headlines. On the other, the divorcee the British Crown could never ever accept. One woman, two versions, and no way to reconcile them. The diary page she burned sat right in that distance, in the space between the Wallis the world was told about, and the Wallis nobody was allowed to read. Ask yourself what a woman would burn at that hour, in that year, with a king about to lose his throne over her. Not a laundry list, not gossip about a dinner party, something that threatened the version she needed the world to keep. Keep that in mind, because we are going to earn our way back to it. First, how it even began. They met around 1931, and they met through another woman. Her name was Thelma, Lady Furness. And at the time, Thelma was the mistress of Edward, the Prince of Wales, the charming, restless heir to the British throne. Wallis and her second husband, Ernest, moved in the same fashionable circles, and Thelma made the introduction herself. A small courtesy, a weekend, a house party, a prince who liked American women because they teased him instead of curtsying to him. For a while, it was nothing. Just another face at Fort Belvedere, the prince's private retreat, where he could shed the stiffness of court and be a man rather than an institution. But somewhere in those early years the balance tipped. Thelma took a trip abroad and, the story goes, asked Wallis to look after the prince while she was away. Wallis looked after him rather well. When Thelma came back, her place was taken. The friend had become the favourite, and the prince did not fall the way men usually fall. He fell completely. Friends and aides described a man reorganising his entire inner life around one person, a man who wanted her opinion on everything and grew anxious when she left the room. This was still the Prince of Wales, remember. A private man, with a private obsession, and the whole apparatus of the monarchy standing between him and the thing he wanted. For the moment, that apparatus held. Then his father died. On the 20th of January, 1936, King George V passed away, and the restless prince, who could not stop thinking about a Baltimore divorcee, became King Edward VIII, sovereign of the largest empire the world had ever seen. Roughly a quarter of the planet now answered, in name, to a man who could barely function without Wallis Simpson beside him. And that was the problem nobody in the palace had planned for. A prince may keep a mistress, and the world looks away. A king is different. A king has boxes to sign, ministers to see, a church to lead, a constitution to embody. A king is not supposed to have a private life that swallows the public one. Edward did, and the people paid to watch him began, very quietly, to notice, because by the winter of that first year, on the throne, the man who adored her wore a crown, and his own aides had started to watch something come apart. The red dispatch boxes, the daily paperwork of ruling an empire, were coming back signed late, or not read at all. Duties were being cancelled. Engagements slipped. The rhythm of a monarchy that had run like a clock for centuries was bending, day by day, around one American woman who was not even his wife, and in some cases had not yet finished being someone else's. The court could see where it was heading before the king could. You cannot turn 1,000 years of institution around a single person and expect it to hold its shape. Something was going to give, and in the drawing rooms of Downing Street, a careful, pipe-smoking Prime Minister named Stanley Baldwin was watching the same collapse the aides were watching and preparing to say a single word out loud that would force the whole thing into the open. The word was Queen, and when he said it plainly. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, sat with his king and laid out the arithmetic that no amount of love could rearrange. Wallis Simpson had been married twice. Both of those former husbands were still alive, and Edward, as king, was not simply a man who could marry whomever he pleased. He was the supreme governor of the Church of England, the defender of the faith, the head of a church that would not remarry a divorced woman while her earlier partners still walked the earth, so the church could not crown her, the government would not have her, and a large part of the British establishment, the men in the clubs, and the cabinet, and the newspapers that had agreed to stay silent, wanted her gone from the story altogether. This is where the two Wallises collided head-on. To the American papers, she was still the Baltimore girl who had captured a king, a romance for the ages. To the people who actually ran Britain, she was a foreign divorcee with a past, standing one wedding away from the throne, and that was intolerable. Baldwin offered no soft landing. There was no compromise on the table that the country would swallow. Edward suggested a morganatic marriage, an arrangement where Wallis would be his wife, but never his queen, never crowned, her children barred from the succession. The cabinet considered it and said no. The Dominions, Australia and Canada among them, said no. Every door Edward tried to open turned out to be painted onto a wall, which left one choice, and only one, stated as cleanly as a sum: the throne or Wallis. He could keep the crown his father had left him and give up the woman. Or he could keep the woman and give up everything else. There was no third door. There never had been. Now, here is where the tidy public story starts to fray, because the version most people grew up with is simple. A woman wanted a king wanted her more, and love won. Except the private record suggests something far less flattering to that fairy tale, and far more human. Because by every account of the people closest to her, Wallis Simpson was not standing at that fireplace in triumph. She was terrified. If you always thought Wallis wanted the crown, listen to what her friends said she actually did next. She ran. In early December of 1936, as the crisis broke into the open, and the newspapers finally printed what all of London had been whispering, Wallis fled England for the south of France. She was driven through the night to escape the reporters, hidden under a blanket on the floor of the car at one point, chased across the channel by a story she could no longer control. And from France, according to friends who spoke of it later, she did the one thing the legend never mentions. She picked up the telephone, a period handset, a crackling line between France and England, and on the other end, a king who was about to throw away 1,000 years of monarchy for her, and she begged him not to. Friends said she urged Edward, down that telephone line, to let her go, to give her up, to keep his crown and stay king and forget she had ever existed. She told him she would step aside. She said she was willing to disappear if it meant he kept the throne. Whether Edward truly listened is another matter. Some who knew him said his mind was already made up, that no telephone call on earth could move him once he had decided. But the call itself changes the shape of everything, because it means the woman history painted as the ambitious American who stole a king may have been, in private, the one person trying hardest to stop him. And she left a trail through those months. Wallis kept a diary. She wrote letters, a great many of them, some of which were published in the years after, and some of which were quietly destroyed. Read the ones that survived, and you find a woman arguing, in ink, against her own legend. Fear, doubt, the sense of being swept along by something enormous that she could not slow down. This is not the correspondence of a schemer closing in on a throne. It reads more like someone watching a wave rise over her head and knowing she cannot get out of its way. Several biographers who went back over that record reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. They argued that Wallis never truly wanted to be the cause of an abdication, that the crown was never the prize she was reaching for, that she had, somewhere along the way, fallen into a love she could not stop and a situation she could not escape, and by the time she understood the full cost, it was already too late to undo. Trapped, in other words, by the very romance the world would celebrate. Hold that telephone call in mind, her voice down a crackling line, begging him to keep the throne, because it changes how you hear what he said next. On the 11th of December, 1936, Edward VIII sat down and signed the instrument of abdication, a single sheet, witnessed by his 3 brothers, ending his reign after just 326 days. He had been king for less than a year, and then he went to the microphone. That evening, he spoke to the whole of the British Empire by radio from a small room at Windsor. His voice carried into millions of homes across Britain and Canada and Australia and India. He told them he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman he loved. The woman he loved. Not the woman who loved him. Not the woman who had begged him, days earlier, down a telephone line, to do the opposite of what he was now doing. Sit with the gap in those two accounts. On the radio, a man giving up an empire for a love so great, he could not live without it. In private, a woman who had already told him she would rather vanish than be the reason the crown fell. Both of those things were said out loud, by the two people at the centre of it. Only one of them was ever meant for the public to hear. After that, the machinery moved fast. His younger brother became King George VI, thrust onto a throne he had never wanted and never expected. Edward was given a new name and a smaller life. He became the Duke of Windsor, a title for a man who was no longer allowed to be anything larger. He left the country almost at once, sailing away from the Britain he had ruled for less than a year, into an exile that would turn out to be permanent. Wallis stayed in France, waiting out the months until her second divorce was final. And then, in June of 1937, they married in France, in a quiet ceremony at a rented chateau, the Chateau de Condé, with almost none of the royal family present. No brothers, no mother. The new king sent no representative. A former sovereign of the British Empire married the woman he had given a crown for, in a borrowed house in the French countryside, watched by a handful of guests and a few loyal servants, and the family he had been born into simply stayed away. The world had its story now. The king who gave up his throne for love, and the American woman he could not live without. It was clean. It was romantic. It fit on a newspaper page, and it would fit in the history books for decades. But that clean version left one document unaccounted for, and it was not the abdication paper the world had read. It was a single page from the diary Wallis kept through those raw December weeks, and the Maid's account, gathered later by biographers, is that this was the page she knelt to burn before the light came up. So consider what that page most likely held, and consider how carefully we have to say it. Nobody living read it. The only witness knelt by the grate for a few seconds, and never got the words. Only the sight of the paper going dark. Everything we can reconstruct about it comes from household testimony, passed hand to hand among the staff who served the Windsors, and gathered by later biographers, who compared what the servants remembered with the paper record of that winter. So this is not a confession recovered. It is a shape left in the ash. But the shape is specific, and it points somewhere. Think about when that page was written. December of 1936. The very weeks the crown was falling. Wallis was not the serene woman of the later photographs then, poised in Paris, drawing rooms with a small dog and a fixed smile. She was frightened. Friends said so at the time. She had already fled to France once. She had already begged Edward down a crackling telephone line to keep his throne and let her go. That is the woman holding the pen. A page written in that state does not read like a love story. It reads like someone trying to work out whether she has ruined a man, and whether she was ever given a real choice. So what may have curled in that grate is her true feeling about the man who gave up everything for her. Not the public gratitude, the private verdict, her doubt, her fear that she had been trapped by a love she could not stop and could not steer. Perhaps the plain admission that she had never wanted to be the reason a king walked away from 1,000 years of monarchy. Words like that would have shamed the tidy story the world was already being handed. the story of a great romance worth a throne, on the page, in her own hand, dated in the worst week of it, that romance might have looked a great deal smaller and a great deal sadder. Whatever you believe was on that page, the fact that she burned it tells you she did not want you to know. That is the hardest and cleanest thing in this whole story. You do not put a page in the fire that flatters you. You do not destroy the evidence that helps your case. You burn the thing that contradicts it. The act itself is the message, which answers the question that has been hanging over this from the first minute. Why before dawn? Why the rush? Why the cold grate? Why the maid roused and standing close in the grey half-dark instead of any other hour? Because morning brought the machinery back. Morning meant secretaries and letters to answer and visitors and the slow, careful construction of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as the world would be asked to see them. Once the light came up, the legend resumed its working day. A page like that could not survive into daylight, because daylight was where the story got built. It had to be gone before the version of history the Windsors intended to leave could pick up its tools again. And here is what makes the fire believable, rather than just a good scene. Wallis did this her whole life, not once, in a panic, at a French fireplace. Constantly, deliberately, for decades, she curated her legend, right down to the letters she chose to keep, the affectionate notes, the fond telegrams, the correspondence that showed a devoted couple weathering exile with dignity. Those she preserved, sorted, and in some cases allowed into print. She understood the archive as a room she was decorating. An elderly duchess going through a box of personal letters is not being sentimental. She is editing. She is deciding which version of herself outlives her. A woman who spent 40 years choosing which pages the future would read is exactly the kind of woman who, one cold morning, chose one page it never would. That closes the question this whole story turned on. Was she trapped, or was she willing? For years, people have argued it both ways, and the honest answer is that the one place her real verdict was ever written down is the one place we can never look. She did not leave it ambiguous by accident. She left it ambiguous on purpose, by fire. The public was given a great love story. The private woman kept a diary that apparently disagreed with it, at least for one page, on one night, and she made sure that disagreement died with the flame. The burning is the answer. She had a private verdict on the romance. It existed, it was written, and she chose ash over the record, which brings us to the gap this began with. The two Wallises, the American fairy tale, the Baltimore girl who won a king, adored by headlines that could not get enough of the divorcee who conquered an empire's heart, and the British threat, the foreigner with a past the establishment feared and the church could never bless. For most of the last century, you were free to pick whichever of those women you preferred, because the evidence seemed to sit outside her, in newspapers and government papers, and the accounts of people who watched from a distance. The diary page was different. The diary page was inside. It was the one document where the woman herself, alone, told the truth, to no one but the paper. And that is precisely the document that no longer exists. So think about what that means now. Sitting here, knowing the abdication the way you were taught it. The romance of Edward and Wallis is one of the most retold love stories of the 20th century. A king who loved so completely, he gave up the greatest throne on earth. And that story is not a lie exactly, but it is, in part, a survivor. It is the version that lived because its rival was destroyed. We remember the grand gesture on the radio, the man who could not carry his burden without the woman he loved, because the counter-testimony, her own, in her own hand, was fed to a fire in France, while the rest of the world slept. Before we stand at that great one last time, one quiet thing, if a channel that separates the palace's polished story from what the staff actually saw is worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and the bell means the next one finds you. There are more of these queued, more nights behind more palace doors where the official version and the private one do not match. That is the whole reason this account exists. Back to the fire then, because that is where this ends. The version of the romance you were taught survived because one page did not. Every biography, every film, every fond retelling of the king who gave up his crown for love, all of it stands on ground that was cleared, deliberately, by the woman at the centre of it. She let the sweet letters live. She let the fond telegrams live. She let the world keep the story it wanted. And the single page that might have told you what she really thought, in the worst week of her life, about the man who handed her his kingdom and his ruin in the same gesture. That page, she knelt down and burned herself. So picture it, the way the Maid never stopped picturing it. A grate in a French house, the last dark before morning. Wallis Warfield of Baltimore, twice married, twice divorced, soon to be the Duchess of Windsor, kneeling on the cold floor in the quiet, a single torn page in her fingers. She feeds it to the flame and she watches. The paper catches, browns at the edge, curls in on itself the way paper does, blackens, lifts a little in the heat, and is gone. A few feet away, a chambermaid stands and says nothing, because there is nothing a servant can say, and watches the one honest record of a queen who never was turned into a smudge of grey against the coals. The light comes up outside the window. The letters she chose to keep are still in their box, waiting to become history. And the one page we can be sure of, the one nobody else ever read, the one that held whatever she could not let anyone see, is already ash in a cold French grate, while the woman who burned it rises, brushes off her knees, and walks back into the version of the story she meant to leave.